Welcome to the Contagious Code podcast, where we dive deep into code, learn practical skills, celebrate the beauty of engineering, and eliminate imposter syndrome. I'm Tejas Kumar, and I've been building on the web for over 20 years at places like Purcell, Spotify, Zeta, and many more. Today on the podcast, my guest is Sacha Greif, the founder of Devographics. Devographics is the company behind the popular State of JS, State of CSS, State of WebDev AI surveys. These surveys are incredible resources that capture developer sentiment today about JavaScript, about frameworks, for example, Svelte, Angular, React, about CSS, the programming language, and how they feel about it, and also about WebDev AI. Who's vibe coding? How much are they vibe coding? What is the percentage of code generated by a machine versus a human being? The really great thing about these surveys is that they capture subjective information at volume. So like, how are you feeling about a tool like Next.js? And the volume of subjective opinion slowly brings it more into the objective fact direction. Not saying it's 100% absolute truth, but close enough because of the massive subjective opinion. It's a really great way to identify what tools should you learn as a company, what tools should you choose for your stack, what technologies should you invest in, and drive action and insight from there. It's truly remarkable what Sacha has created over the past 7 years. He started this in 2016. In our discussion today, we identify what it takes to create a really great survey. How do you remove bias? And how do you decide, for example, who should take a JavaScript survey? Should anyone take it? Should just JavaScript developers take it? Is there a minimum experience level? We talk about how do you process the data effectively? How do you crunch the numbers in a way that eliminates, again, double measures and bias and things like that? And how do you then visualize it? Do you use cohort charts? Do you use quadrant analysis? Do you use bar graphs, pie charts, etc.? And we really come to what it takes to create a world-class survey like the State of JS, State of CSS, and State of WebDev AI surveys. We also talk about his biggest insights and lessons from running the surveys over the past 7 years. And it's really interesting because I'll spoil it for you now. One of the biggest insights that he has is that all this hype stuff you see from influencers is just wrong. We have the feeling, the perception that things move really, really fast and we're missing out and we have to learn a million things before we have a competitive chance in the job market, for example. And he's like, that's simply not true. Social media moves way faster than the actual world. And if you're not like vibe coding or doing the latest hype thing today, then you're totally fine. You're not going to miss out on opportunities. This is what his data reveals, which is I believe, relaxing and peaceful for many of us who are struggling with sort of the anxiety and the stress of keeping up with everything. The good news, the gospel, is that you don't have to keep up with any of this. In fact, if it's important enough, it will find you. The other big insight that he shares in our discussion is how tools tend to win over another. For example, web developers were using a tool called Webpack a lot early in the day, and this was superseded by Vite, which is essentially the superior Webpack. Similar, React is the most popular way to build websites today, but previously people used tools like jQuery. How does one tool start and then win over another tool? He identifies this clearly. It's so incredible. We end the discussion on an optimistic note about the hope for impact he has through these surveys. And what he wants these surveys to become a good source of truth for actionable data, similar to how developers will use tools like MDN for documentation or caniuse.com to check browser compatibility. He wants the State of JS, CSS, WebDev AI to be these kinds of surveys. Before we begin the discussion, I have a very important call to action. I need all of you to listen and do this. They are currently, at this point in time, right now, running a survey called the State of Devs, the State of Developers. And the survey's goal is to find out, who are we collectively? Like, what are our habits? What do we experience? What do we enjoy? And it covers a broad range of topics for developers, from physical health practices. Do you meditate? Do you do resistance training? Do you do cardio? To your food habits, to even workplace topics. Have you experienced discrimination? Do you experience inequality? What is your salary? Of course, all the data is anonymous. Your email address is never stored. It's hashed. He also mentions that in the episode. But If you take the survey and we collect enough data, we can answer questions like, hey, developers typically experience, this percentage of developers experience discrimination in the workplace. This percentage of developers have poor health because of these lifestyle factors. And then through that, we can identify courses of action and interventions to increase the quality of life for developers worldwide. It's going to have huge impact. And I'd encourage you, the link is in the show notes to take the State of Devs survey. Let's continue with the episode. But before that, I need to emphasize this is very much separate to my day job. And the way you can even make this podcast possible is through partners. Let's take a moment to acknowledge our partner. And if you're interested in partnering and sponsoring the podcast, please do reach out. All the links are in the show notes. The Contagious Code podcast is partnered with Code Crafters. Code Crafters is a great way to level up your coding skills. And it works by having you choose a tool that developers use, like Git or Redis or Docker, some tool like this, and a programming language like Python, Rust, JavaScript. And what it'll have you do is it'll have you rebuild that tool from scratch in a programming language that you choose. And by doing this, you get better at the programming language, but also better at the tool because you literally make it. It's a great way to level up. And they have a generous free tier, but if you want to start paying, there's a link in the show notes that gives you a massive discount. That's tej.as/codecrafters. Thank you so much for sticking around. Here's my discussion with Sacha Greif. Sacha, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. I've been a fan of your surveys for a long time, since 2016, I believe.
Oh, wow.
And yeah. I followed it all the way back then. And it's just, it's so good to have you on the podcast and talk about, what makes a great survey, but also some of the interesting trends that perhaps you would know perhaps better than others, given that you're in this is your thing. But maybe to get started, I'd love to talk about just describing sort of the goal and the scope of these surveys.
Yeah, sure. So, I'm not assuming that everybody is familiar with the survey. So just to give some context, I run, surveys about JavaScript, CSS, like the main web technologies, targeted at web developers. And so they have kind of multiple parallel goals, but I'd say the main one is to anticipate new trends, and mainly to help people decide what to learn. So that's really the problem I wanted to solve for myself, at least. When I started the surveys back in 2016, it was very confusing to know what to learn. I mean, in some ways it still is. But back then, React and Vue were pretty new, so it wasn't that clear that they were going to be the juggernaut that they are today. And so, I just wanted to get some more data to know, is it worth it spending, a month, 6 months, a couple years of your life, like investing into a framework? And then beyond that, once I started doing surveys in other domains, it also became more about features, especially in CSS. So, CSS in the last couple of years has been evolving really fast and kind of too fast to keep up with everything. So the surveys are a way that you can get a recap once a year of everything that's new, see what other people are investing their own time in, and based on that, and, other factors as well, but kind of start deciding what to learn next.
That's such a great set of goals, honestly, because I've had so many people talking to me, even at conferences, who ask, hey, what should I learn? And exactly, back in the day, there was people going, hey, is React worth learning? Is it the thing? I think we see a similar state now with, is AI worth it, or is it just another hype cycle? I think a big topic now is MCP, yeah? Like everybody's talking about Model Context Protocol, and some are saying, yes, spend your whole life investing in the Kenzie Dodds, for example, previous guest, is just going all in on MCP, but others are skeptical because, for example, vector databases used to be a big hype topic in AI, and now it's pretty low value. And so it's so awesome to have like a definitive source of truth for like, hey, this is the vibe. Literally, this is what everybody says is worth learning. And then you can use that data. That's a really data-driven approach. Like I bump into so many people at events, and usually people are asking this question, but not everybody is answering it the way you answered it, which is like, I'm just going to start a survey. What leads to that? Because I have to assume a lot of people thought maybe I should start a survey, but they never followed through with it. Probably because maybe of a lack of volume data, right? But I'm curious. You had this idea that I think is not unique to you, but then executed it in such a way where it actually has traction. How? Why do you think these surveys resonate so much with developers?
Yeah, that's a good question. I kind of my product development philosophy in a way is that you can do anything, and if you do it like long enough, it will work. It will get value just by the fact that you're doing it for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And I feel
Interesting.
that surveys are a bit like that. Like, it's true that they were fairly successful right from the start. There was interest there, but also I think a lot of the value today is just the fact that I've been doing them over and over again. I've improved the technology, the UI, the way I collect data. I have built up an audience. So in a way, it's a bit self-sustaining like that. But yeah, initially, I think there was just an appetite for more data, especially like qualitative data. Um, or I don't know if I'm using it's kind of ambiguous because it has other meanings. But what I mean here is data about how people feel rather than just number of downloads or number of stars on GitHub, which are very like cold
Quantitative.
metrics, quantitative metrics. And what I'm doing is also quantitative in a way, but there's this aspect that I'm asking people what they think, how they feel about the frameworks they are using or the features they are using. And I think that was fairly new. Like, I wasn't aware of other surveys or other resources that included that. And what prompted that that initial idea was precisely what you're talking about, like MCP, vector databases. 10 years ago, it was maybe Angular, Redux, and all the conferences were about Redux. Like, all the talks, people were, and I gave a talk about Redux, and I've never used
Wow.
Redux before or since, and that's not no shade on Redux, and especially the new Redux toolkit now is a really, really great tool. But at the time, I think there was a big like overhyping of Redux, and it's kind of for me, it's the poster child of, okay, there's all this. It's a great thing. It has a great team behind it. The concepts are great. The technology is great, but what do people actually think? And turns out a lot of people thought Redux is great, but it's not for me. Same thing with GraphQL. I use GraphQL and I love it, but I can recognize that it's probably not for everybody. And it was a bit like oversold by the people who were pushing that technology a couple years ago. And I think a lot of GraphQL developers today will happily say that, yeah, it's not for everybody. It's not for every use case. And so that's the kind of thing where, raw data in terms of downloads, tweets, stars, whatever, it's not really going to tell you that. But if you actually talk to people, ask them what they think, you'll get that signal much earlier than if you wait, a couple of years and realize it by yourself.
And that signal is such a difference maker. It can set the pace of your career, maybe your business. You can invest in the right technology immediately. That signal to get from noise is so important, which again is why the value of your work is so clear. You wrote a really engaging blog post on Dev2 that I referenced and love to read. Frankly, it's you titled it "How the State of JS/CSS Surveys Are Run." We'll put a link to that in the show notes. But you talk about these like this balancing act of like what it was continuity, fairness, inclusivity, brevity, the ability to process and actionability. You talked about these pillars that you need to balance across, and I found it quite insightful. I'm wondering if, because given you just said the reason it resonates so well with developers is you just show up. You show up every time and you consistently do something long enough to where it cannot be ignored and people start paying attention. And maybe after paying attention, people even start paying a fee. I know this is not monetized, but why not? And so I'm just thinking, tying that with this thing you wrote about balancing across these few pillars. I wonder if you could elaborate on those pillars a little bit more. You already kind of touched on continuity, which is just keep doing it long enough. But there's elements of fairness, inclusivity, brevity, processing, and actionability that I wonder if we can maybe go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, sure. So you'll have to feed them to me one by one, because I can't even remember what I had for breakfast, let alone what I wrote like last year. But yeah, I think so. Brevity, for example, the longer the survey is, the fewer responses you'll have. Like that's a
Yeah,
pretty strong correlation.
because people get bored and like abandon it
Yeah.
halfway. Okay.
And also, if you have somebody who's like on the fence, maybe they're like, I'm not sure if the survey is for me because I don't really feel like, I'm a great developer, a bit of an imposter syndrome thing going on. If they see like a 15-page survey, they're going to bail out at a much higher rate than somebody who's been doing it for 20 years, senior engineer. So that kind of, I think having a long survey also biases the kind of responses you will get. So definitely the shorter the survey, the better. But
Okay.
of course, you do want to be thorough and cover all your bases. So that's why it's always a balancing act
Yeah,
between both.
I really liked your point about continuity, and I want to differentiate this from consistency because you said the way you resonate with developers, you just keep showing up every single time, and I agree with that. For example, Kent resonates well with developers, Kent Lee Dodds, because he just shows up like all the time. But outside of consistency, continuity you mentioned as one of these pillars for a great survey, I think is so profound because in your post, you said asking the same questions as last year means we can analyze data over time. And it sounds maybe obvious from like when you say it like that, but if I consider, for example, the case of my health data, so I wear like a smart ring and an Apple Watch, and it's just constantly like passively sending data over time to my database. It's so powerful when we analyze the change of data over time, especially when it comes now to frameworks like React, which is, 12 years old, I think now. Interesting. This continuity pillar is so cool because you get to watch maybe the hype cycle according to Gartner. Yeah, the stage where people are really getting into the thing, people are maybe getting out of the thing, etc. I think also if, like vector databases, for example, if there was a survey about these, we just talked about this, you would probably see some type of curve. Does that track with continuity the way you define it in your blog post?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's really down to small things like if you ask for salaries, like income, the brackets that you offer, do you earn between, 10,000 and 20,000? If the next year you change it to 10,000 and 30,000, all of a sudden you lose that ability to have a nice, chart showing the successive income levels, unless you do some fudging in the back end, but it adds a ton of overhead. So that's why you have to be really careful about changing anything. And that even then it still happens. Like there's, we did change the format we use for our main questions. And one of the chart was like completely thrown off and it looked like a black hole. Like all the
Whoa!
lines were like going into the middle. Because
What question was this?
well, it's all the, do you use React? Do you like it? Do you have a positive opinion? And so on for all those different libraries. But we changed it a bit, and I kind of messed up one thing in the way I harmonized the data with past data, and then the chart was like completely messed up, and I fixed it later on. But it was a pretty good illustration that if you're not careful with continuity, then the data will say something completely different.
Garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah.
Crazy. When you design one of these surveys, how do you clearly identify your audience? Meaning, my mother could identify as a JavaScript developer, or actually my father, because he wrote like one page one time, versus there's, let's use Kent Lee Dodds again. Why not? He's also a JavaScript developer. Everyone's a JavaScript
Sure.
developer. But specifically for the survey, how do you narrow that scope a little bit? I mean, it's probably useful to narrow that scope a little bit because otherwise you get really noisy data.
Well, so I don't know if that's the right way to do it, but at least my strategy is to collect as much data as possible. So, even if you've written only one line of JavaScript, maybe you've never written JavaScript, for whatever reason you want to take a JavaScript survey, you can. And I'm happy to have your input. I mean, I think everybody has something to contribute. On the other hand, I try to provide tools to people on the other side to filter the data how they see fit. So if you think, well, I'm not going to take any advice from people who've only done 1 year of JavaScript, then you just filter out people with less than 1 year of experience, and you can customize the charts based on that. if you're like, well, I'm in the US, so I'm only interested in what other people in the US think, you can do that, and so on. So rather than myself decide, okay, the ideal sample is, X% women, X% men, and people from here and there, and this demographic makeup, because I don't feel qualified to do that, and it would be very hard, practically speaking. I just collect all the data and then try to give you the tools to filter it down.
That's amazing. I wish science was done this way. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like, instead of the researchers pre-filtering, just get a big swath of data and then offer the audience or the readers to filter that. That's awesome. And I guess that's probably one of the reasons it resonates so well with developers, both who take it and who also read the results later. But you don't do this for technologies, yeah? For example, React, Vue, Svelte, Astro, whatever. Those are, in a sense, hard-coded in the survey. Or do I misunderstand? Like, can anyone taking the survey just like enter, I feel this way about this technology?
No, you're right. So we have, let's say, main technologies, main features, which do have that three option question format where you're like, never used it, never heard of it, use it. And for these, we have like maybe 10 items max in each category.
How do you decide those items?
It's usually not super hard because there's always like clear leaders in most categories. And then if we miss something, and because people can submit like other answers. So if something really shows up high in the other answers, we add it the next year to the list. And if something, on the other hand, is really, really low, we can also drop it and demote it to another list. But I would say that the issue is not so much like popularity-wise, but more like category-wise. For example, Astro, people might cite it in the front-end frameworks because it has its own like a template, syntax, whatever it is. But for me, it's more like a meta framework. It's also kind of a backend framework, but you see what I mean? Like people are more liable to put one thing in another category and then complain about that rather than really argue about, this thing should be higher up or thing like that, because most of the time, there's pretty clear separation
between the leaders and the not. And I like what you said, use historical data to also inform this. Interesting. You could even use historical data to see like, hey, what was growing and now has it grown or is it no longer considered? You can really, you could visualize hype cycles so well with all of your historical data.
Yeah, we do. yeah.
That's amazing.
But I think that's actually, it's interesting that you bring that up because I think we get the impression that there's dozens, hundreds of, let's say, front-end frameworks.
That's what people say, right? Like at conferences, they say, there's a new framework every week and I don't know which one to choose. And
But if you actually look at the data, there's like 5 that have, that are big, and then everything else is really tiny. Like, you have React, Vue, Angular, Svelte, and maybe Solid, and then it drops off really fast. So it's again, like, those other frameworks are still great, but if for a survey, we're interested in measuring things in terms of usage and popularity and so on. So it makes sense for us at least to concentrate on the top ones.
That's good. What does it take to make the perfect question or question set? And the reason I ask, I have to prepare questions. I host a podcast, and part of it is like you have to think of things to ask you about. Thankfully, I find you as a guest and your work super interesting, so I already I can just, it's not a very hard thing to come up with questions because I'm like, oh, how does he do that? But this is super meta because I'm asking you a question about questions, because in a survey, I've heard that you get more value out of non-binary questions, meaning if a question can be answered not like by yes or no, but instead of like, do you like React, more what do you like about React, or why do you like React? But then this is more of a burden on the person taking the survey, which is maybe harder to answer, so maybe they abandon this question. So I'm curious, like, with all of this factors, like, what does it take to actually make like a really great question that is not only going to give you like an answer every time, but high signal to noise every time?
Well, again, it's all about trade-offs. For example, you could ask, do you use React? Yes, no. And that's going to give you a very clear signal, but it doesn't give you that much insight. You
Right.
can also ask which version of React do you use? Version 17, 18, 19, and I don't use React. And then you're getting the same data as before, but you also get the version, and it's still only one question, so it's still only one click for the respondent. So I try to think about it in terms of never, if there's a version of the question that's going to bring me more data, then I ask that as much as possible. And the other thing is you also want to try to avoid questions that are too open-ended, right? So we do ask things like, what do you like about React? But then over the years, we've had to build an infrastructure to actually process the resulting data, because people will say, well, I like the hooks, I like a JSX, but even two people who say hooks, they might spell it different way, they might have typos, or then one might say I like use state, the other one I say I like the state management hook. So then if you have freeform data, you need a step to process all that back into usable data. And if you can provide, for example, a list of pre-filled options, that's going to save you a lot of time. So instead of having an open-ended question, just have, what do you like about React? A, the hooks. B, JSX. C, use effect. I don't know. Nobody is going to say that.
Yeah.
But,
So you can then take maybe historic data, should you have a repeat question, which you said you do, and then you can generate like these choices based off of the most common.
Yes.
Oh, that's awesome. That's so cool. And so if I understand correctly, these surveys are just like a big web app, so you can do that.
Yes. Yeah. So we've developed our own web app. We're not using Google Forms or anything like that. And that's pretty cool. It's more work, obviously, but then it means we can really customize it. We can have custom form controls. So I think it's also a value add compared to other similar surveys.
Yeah, you can have also like pre-baked auto-suggest answers based on the most popular things. That's so cool. There's probably also an application here for some type of AI thing.
Yeah, well, I think that the future of surveys will be, just tell us what you think, and the AI will process it into usable data, basically.
Yes. Say more about that.
Oh, well, there's no reason. So again, going back to your conversation with Kent, he was talking about how we use buttons and forms, but the best UI would be, in theory, just talking to someone who's very qualified and can execute on your requests. And I think for surveys, it might be the same. Like, what do you like about React? Or how do you use React? And then let people even just talk, record a voice memo directly into the survey app. And then if you have ChatGPT or whatever that's capable of analyzing that data and extracting the tokens that are going to match to the data you want to, represent, you don't even need, those forms and those buttons, radio buttons, checkboxes anymore.
So awesome. So the survey, we've come full circle to where surveys used to be telephone calls.
Yeah.
And they just come back there, but the one making the call is some type of agent. That's awesome. I would actually take this survey. Like if I'm, like on my way back from the gym or something and I get a phone call and the caller ID is like Sacha Greif, or if it's State of JS survey is calling you, I would literally just pick up the phone and be like, hi, and it would my expectation is this would just be like a natural language, like, hi, I have a few questions, do you like React? And then I can just yap, talk about how I hate this and how I love that, and thanks for your time, bye, the call ends, and then you have this data. Wow, that's so cool.
So I mean, I'm not saying I'm going to go in that direction necessarily, because I think developers still like to actually interact with a real UI and it's faster and so on. But I think
that's all the developers of yesterday.
Maybe. But I do think there's going to be a market for this kind of survey, and it already exists, actually. But yeah, so what we are doing is kind of halfway, where we still collect data via text fields, text areas, forms, and so on. But we are starting to use ChatGPT and other LLMs to process the data and extract those tokens. And it works okay, but I think you can really see like how it's going to be in like 6 months or a year. It's going to be 10 times better because of right now there's like context size limitations. It's kind of hard to get it to do exactly what you want still, and
Yeah,
it's
it's
evolving
also
really fast. So
yeah, and there's also room for hallucinations and non-determinism, which in a survey you're like,
yes,
I don't know if I want that. Awesome, thank you. By the way, you mentioned this is a web app. It's fully open source, yeah? Because I saw again in this
yes.
blog post that you can just the survey design itself can be influenced and affected via GitHub issues. If you have an issue with, pun intended, if you have an issue with the survey, just go open an issue and it'll be fixed.
Yeah, and there is at least one team, the React Native survey team, which is using our stack completely independent of myself. So it's pretty cool. They've been able to, implement the survey app, the form, the data processing backend, the API, and also the results site, the static app that you actually look at the charts with. So yeah, I don't know if there's a word for this kind of open source where it's not like you want to publicize it and share it, but it's just like, yeah, you can look at it if you want. But so that's what it is, and it's kind of nice that people can actually make use of it, I think.
Yeah. Is there monetization somewhere on the radar with this type of thing? And I'm asking because it's value, and usually value costs money, which is a good thing. I think like paying for I pay $20 a month for a cursor, and I think it's great because it's value. I pay $20 a month for Perplexity, and I think it's great because value, right? And so this is a highly valuable thing, especially I think for companies. Like a company starting projects, they want to know where to invest. Okay, well the survey says React, and so let's use React. That's value, and so I think value deserves cash. What's the take on that? Like, are you making a company out of this, or where's it going in that sense?
Yeah, so I have a company, or still in my name. It's still like a personal company, whatever you call it. But I am turning it into a business. But the main income source is sponsoring from companies right now, mainly Google, but also a company here in Japan called Tokyo Dev, which helps people find English-speaking jobs in Japan. We have also front-end masters, so I'm just shouting out my supporters.
Good, they're doing good work.
Yeah, I'm very grateful to them. One thing I don't really want to do is take people's money to look at the data, because people contribute their answers freely, right? So it feels a bit wrong to then charge them for access to their own answers. In a way, and also it would just limit the reach of the results, I think. So I am selling T-shirts, which doesn't earn a ton, but it's fun to do. And yeah, one thing I could do. People say, "Oh, you should, make it a product. You should let companies run surveys on your platform." But I think I've tried that a bit, and it's so much work that at least right now I feel I'd rather focus on the surveys, the state of JS, state of CS as the main surveys. And maybe one day, if those run really like on autopilot, I might, look into another direction, maybe white labeling the survey, maybe running surveys in partnership for other companies. But to me, at least, running, being like almost like a publisher, a news publisher that puts out surveys, and developing a product that lets other people build surveys, are two completely different things. They're different focuses, different skill sets, and I don't think I could do both well right now. So that's why I'm really focused on being a publisher and not so much. And if people want to reuse the tools for free, they can go ahead and do it. But I'm not monetizing that.
I respect everything you said very, very greatly. I wish there was a term for the bubble that me and many of us live in. And by many of us, I mean those in my bubble. I mean people like Kent C. Dodds, people like Jack Harrington, many, many guests on the podcast. We all are in some type of bubble where we came from early web, Photoshop, Dreamweaver. I think you, Sasha, were part of this. And then we got into Ajax and things like MooTools and Scriptaculous because we're just building websites. And then, jQuery, and then Angular, and then React. But now, AI, which is different. It's not front-end, but it never was front-end. I think it was always ultimately UX and taste, whether it's Photoshop or jQuery or MooTools or React. UX is just a means to an end, as Kent says. And so maybe that's the bubble. Maybe it's the UX bubble. But I would love so much to have like a state of my bubble survey, which or maybe state of UX where it's like I think actually this would be super valuable. And I'm not asking you to do it, but when everything's on autopilot, if you want to branch out, like state of UX. What
Yeah.
creates what creates remarkable UX and what is taste? Because I think one of the beautiful things about your survey is it takes like a high volume of subjective opinion and then turns it into objective truth because of the volume of subjective opinion. Does that make sense? Like the sky is not really blue and we don't really know if green is green, but because we all see the same thing, we say it's objectively green. But like our vision is 100% subjective. It's just a mass effect of subjective makes it objective. And you do that for JS, but I want like UX is inherently a subjective thing. So I think through that type of survey, we'll be able to actually like understand why why was the iPhone so revolutionary? What subjective taste thing made it awesome? And the same reason, why did the Vision Pro fail? Like a state of I feel like a state of UX. Or am I talking nonsense here? But I don't know. It just sounds so interesting.
No, I think, my roots are as a designer, actually. So I'm super interested in design and UX. I would love to do a state of design and maybe also a state of UX. I don't know at some point. But you're right. The challenge would be that it's harder to quantify, I think. You know, but yeah, maybe that's also what makes it more interesting on some level.
Yeah. Yeah, I have to restate what I just said because your survey, I think this is the thing it does exceptionally well. Now that we've reached this point in the discussion, which is you literally just take subjective opinion and make it objective fact. You take, for example, you ask question, how do you feel
Well,
about
okay,
Svelte, right?
yeah, I need. Let's say I make it less subjective, but I don't think I wouldn't want people to think that I am putting myself out there as like the objective truth because the name is State of JS, which is kind of a marketing gimmick to give myself credibility. But deep down, I know that it's not the state because your dad does JS, my dad does JS, and they might never have heard of React. Maybe they're just typing plain JavaScript code in their browser, and that's JS as well. So yeah, that's a criticism I have, but it's based on, I think, a misconception because the surveys are meant to tell you, okay, these people took the survey and this is what they think. It's not meant to tell you this is what everybody thinks. This is the absolute truth. So I just want to caveat this, before I get too many angry emails.
I like that. I like that. But if I will push back a little bit and say there is no absolute truth. Like even with
Yeah.
science, everybody sees green except there's also blind people and colorblind people. So like that's kind of the same as your. No, but I appreciate the nuance there. I still think you bring it closer to absolute truth than most. And so I think that's the value. That said, there is an argument to be made for like bias and also like imbalances with demographic. You may. I'm curious about your answer. You may say you move this responsibility of filtering also to the people reading a survey. For example, I only want to know what women think. Is that actually something people can select, or do
Yeah.
you handle this? Okay, wow, cool. So you can literally just do like, hey, what do all women think about front end libraries?
Yes. Yeah, you can definitely do that. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's so cool. I clearly haven't like dug into this tool as much as I should have. That's really awesome. One question: there's barriers with language though. Some of the best engineers I know are Russian. They don't support the war, but they just like crazy Russian hackers, and we want to include them, I guess. So my question is the survey multilingual? Or if not, like, can it be translated via Google Translate or something like that?
Yeah, so it is multilingual, and we have volunteers who translate it. I have to confess, though, that it's kind of it's a big effort, both on the volunteers' part, but also on myself, like to coordinate things. For whatever reason, I also build my own like kind of translation infrastructure, which isn't that great. I think it could be improved. So it's still a work in progress. But yeah, we have Alina is like doing Ukrainian translations, and she's been doing like really awesome work. But yeah, if it really depends on volunteers, and everybody's busy, so sometimes some languages get translated and some don't. Uh, Ultimately, I would love to have a more like, well thought out system where I can hire people, reward volunteers, and so on. But yeah, that's still on the roadmap right now.
So can it happen that your translations are not consistent year to year?
I mean, it could. The worries would be more that they're not consistent between languages, I think. So, if the Russian question is not phrased the same way as the English question, you might introduce some bias in the responses based on that, which would be a problem. And I don't speak Russian, so it would be hard for me to know that. But that's how it is right now, at least.
The reason I'm asking is because it would be nice to understand the how the results change if, for example, in like 2017 you had Russian translations, 2018 you didn't, but you still got the same number of respondents. You know what I mean? Like that would be so interesting because that would definitely color the results a little bit.
Yeah, so you can also filter by the locale that people used to take the survey. So you can look into that. Anecdotally speaking, I've never really found correlations between like non-technical factors and technical factors. By that I mean it doesn't seem like your country or gender or race or whatever really affects your technical choices. At least so far, I haven't found that correlation. And
Okay.
intuitively, I don't think, the one example I've had in the past is at some point Vue was very popular in China and not so much in the rest of the world, but now Vue is popular everywhere. I think there's a really like a homogenization of technology across the world. And so I think it would be super interesting to find this correlation, and especially if you could like explain it between, language or a type of person and technology use. But so far, at least, it's more correlated with maybe things like company size, years of experience, age, which is also super interesting, but it's maybe less, unexpected, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you? So as I understand, every question is optional in the survey. Every question you don't have to answer what you don't want to answer. I find that so interesting because that can also color the results a little bit. Yeah, unless because you don't have like a definite sample size across the entire survey. You have per question sample sizes. I'm curious, what's your approach there since every question's optional?
Yeah, so kind of like I was saying before, I tried to show on the chart like how many people answered this specific question. So which percentage of all respondents answered the question, for example. I tried to also be very specific about if we show a percentage, is it a percentage of all the people who took the survey, or is it a percentage of people who answered that question? Because, for podcast, for example, you can have 50% of question
Right.
respondents listen to your podcast, but turns out that's actually only 5% of survey respondents because most people maybe don't listen to podcasts at all. So yeah, again, it's really about transparency and clarity. Because yeah, we don't want to make the questions mandatory because then people would probably drop out, and sometimes you don't want to answer something. So you also, in addition, you can skip a question by just not answering it, or there's actually a physical skip button on every question, which will mark the question as completed, like really cross it through, so you can still finish the survey, like get to 100% completion, while not having to answer everything.
Interesting. Do you have a podcast section on the survey?
Yes. Usually in the state of JS, whenever there's a resource section, we ask about podcasts as well.
Let me guess, this one is not on the list. Huh?
It might not be yet, but I'm sure it's gaining ground.
I've Totally, absolutely. I had to ask, and to be fair, I'm not surprised, and I wouldn't be either way. Because fun fact, I don't even check metrics on this podcast ever, because I'm scared of doing it for the wrong reasons. I used to, maybe as an aside, I used to be a YouTuber. I used to try it and have like a YouTube channel and stuff. But I found myself like obsessed with the analytics. I was constantly looking at like how many people watch this. Oh my gosh, they only watched 3 minutes. It's an 8 minute video. And like I was like having all this anxiety to the point where I started to become one of these thumbnail people. You know, like the thumbnail people, like they have this like this face on the and I was like, oh, I don't want to be that. I want to create like nuanced value. I don't want to be like, ChatGPT is bad. Like that's a thumbnail. So anyway, that's the whole, I don't even look at analytics. And if it is on your survey, I would rather find out by someone texting me and going like, hey, you're doing well. Instead of like me checking it proactive. Anyway, you mentioned it's optional because people drop out and people don't, they're more likely to abandon if you like force them to answer things. I like that. What other indicators do you have there that tells you like, hey, people aren't really feeling this? Do you maybe measure like at what point in the survey do people just leave? Do you measure time taken per question to answer? This would give you a confidence score, right? Like if somebody immediately votes, how much do you like React? Boom, instant 10. That means it's somehow weighted stronger than if they take like 5 minutes to hesitate. Oh, 10, no 9, no 8. So I'm curious, maybe we can talk a little bit about passive indicators without people explicitly answering, the implicit indications for weight of an answer, and also the performance of the survey itself. Like, do people like it or not?
Yeah, so I don't do that. I don't track how much time people spend answering questions. I think there's a bit of an aspect where if you start tracking too many things, you kind of hurt your own credibility, like it's like, so we do track like a browser version, browser system, this kind of metadata. But at some point, I don't know, there's a line where if you also track, where people are clicking, how long they're taking to answer a question, and then you publish that data, I feel like people might start thinking, okay, maybe they're collecting too much. Maybe they know too much about me. So I want to be careful about that as well, because all the data we collect is actually public. So it's not like we keep any of the data. Yeah. So,
but you just said this is not something you would sell to companies, I guess. So you give it away for free.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah.
Whoa.
So if you're, I actually used to just have the link to the CSV file right there, but now I ask people to just get in touch on Discord or by email, and I'll send them the data set. If you're a researcher, or even if you just want to look at the raw data. But then in turn, it means we are very careful about not collecting any sensitive data. So we don't collect emails, names. We don't even know your email. So that's something I like to explain. Like when you enter your email, it gets hashed, compared with the hash in the database, but we don't store your email at any point. So even if I wanted to like email the people who took the survey, I can't do that. So that's why we have like a separate mailing list that you sign up for separately from the survey. So so talking about passive metrics, I think it would be cool, but at the same time, I would only start doing that if I'm comfortable being very transparent about what I'm collecting.
Yeah, you could even do a survey about would people be comfortable with passive metrics or not, just being super meta.
Yeah, well, okay, one thing I never did but I wanted to do is at the end of the survey show you all the metrics we are collecting and let you like uncheck those you don't want to give us.
That's so German. I mean, I love it, but it's like it screams GDPR. It screams like high responsibility. Yeah. I love it, and that's maybe why like the early question, why does this resonate so much with developers? It's because I think there's just a very strong show of respect. Hey, I respect you as a developer. I respect your time. I respect your privacy. What makes you comfortable? And I think a lot of folks just don't do that. So once again, man, kudos for that.
Yeah, so that's on my to-do list at some point.
That's awesome. You've received a lot of criticism about this, which is why previously you were like, wait, it's not absolute truth. I've seen some of this, and I agree with some, I don't agree with some, whatever. But I think probably the one that I keep seeing over and over again is this one around like people, like influential people, and how it's always men. I think that's something I see a lot on Twitter specifically, or X, where people go like, hey, where's the women? And now this is a difficult spot to be in because statistically there just are more men in tech, which is another systemic problem in general. And so of course your data is going to be biased that way because of the intrinsic like industry statistics. And some are even suggesting you balance it out, but then this would be inaccurate to the broader context of the industry. So, like, what's the answer? I mean, there's probably some thought that's gone into this. For example, whenever I face criticism, people literally criticize this podcast. They're like, "You just talk to all men." That's not true anymore. But they, sometimes they'll say that, or sometimes they'll be like, "Hey, you only talk to your friends." It's nepotism. They accuse me of nepotism. I just happen to have many friends. But anyway, when I receive criticism, there's like, let's take it, let's think about it, and let's come up with a plan. I'm curious, in response to this and other criticisms, what does it look like for the future of the survey?
Yeah, so just to get people up to speed, well, okay, the root of the issue is that very few women take the surveys in general. We have something like a 6-7% participation rate for women.
Wow.
And that's because, well, okay, one, there's fewer women than men. And okay, let's be very binary. I know there's also non-binary folks out there. There's a whole spectrum. But I do think it's, oversimplifying maybe, but it makes it easier to talk about women as a symptom of the overall problem. So there's fewer women that are programmers to begin with, right? I think we can agree on that.
Well, maybe we can say there's a majority of male identifying people.
Yeah.
Therefore, yeah,
perfect. Yeah. And then the women that are brave enough to be in tech despite all the horrible things that they have to endure, they get maybe harassed online. They see that all the big voices on X, whatever, are men. They don't identify with those. They don't feel represented, so they don't participate in those online spaces. Maybe they find their own spaces that are better, smaller, whatever. But then that's like a second, funnel where there was a minority to begin with, then the minority doesn't feel like welcome in the online space and participates less in that space. Now, when a survey comes around, that gets compounded because the survey is spread through X or Hacker News or Reddit, whatever, and these spaces are not that welcoming to women or BIPOC people or whoever you want to talk
minorities about. In general, yeah.
Minorities in general, exactly. And beyond that, there's then the issues with the survey itself. For example, we have a mailing list. If our mailing list the first year is 90% men, it gets compiled year over year because maybe those people share it with their own colleagues, which are maybe more likely to be men. So I would say there's all these compounding factors that lead to this imbalance. Now, the thing that you were talking about regarding like, why are the influencers men? Well, it's because our process is, okay, let's look at who got the most votes in 2024, and then we use that as the basis for the list in 2025, the list of options you get in the survey. And then, of course, what happened is that in 2024, men got the most votes because men have a larger audience. On YouTube, for example, there are awesome women video creators, but the truth is the ones with the highest number of subscribers happen to be male. So they're going to score higher, and then the list the next year was based on those results. So that's why there were no women, I think, in that list of, I think it was video creators in the state of JS. The solution was just, okay, this doesn't work, this process doesn't work, let's just keep it as a free-form field every year. So, because originally what I wanted to do was 1 year it's free-form, so there is no bias, and the next year it's predefined options so we can collect more data and kind of make it easier for people to fill in the survey. So let's scrap that, let's keep it free-form all the time, every year, and this way at least we don't reintroduce a bias based on previous surveys, right? We still have the bias inherent in the tech industry. We still have the bias inherent in Twitter. We have the bias inherent to our mailing list or whatever, but we don't, on top of that, bias things even more. And the lesson I learned, so lesson one was, okay, I was wrong. That was a dumb idea, trying to kind of be too smart and kind of alternate with freeform, predefined, whatever. Forget that. I think the overall lesson, the more important lesson, was that I was valuing the wrong things. I was valuing the process. Like, oh, I need to get it right. If I can explain why, it's like, trying to explain racism, or, okay, I have a justification for why it's good to discriminate against these people. No, no matter how good your justification is going to be, you're sending the wrong message, right? Like, it's the fact that people, even if you think it's wrong, even if you think, oh, you're right and there's a good explanation, the fact that people won't get that explanation and will take the wrong lesson from that's your mistake. That's your problem. So I realized, my role is not to convince people that I'm right. My role is to do things in a way that I don't need to, explain myself. It doesn't send the wrong message to begin with. I don't know if I'm being clear, but it was kind of a switch I needed to make where, because I spent so much time trying to explain to people, no, look, it's not, there's a reason why, there's no women. I was kind of, oblivious to the actual problem that, there's no women in that list. That's just stop there. That's the problem already.
Yeah. And I appreciate your explanation so far of that. It's one of those things that is so complex because sometimes the way the world is the way we don't want it to be, and we can explain it, but honestly we can't excuse it. Yeah, and I think that's kind of the middle of that is where we do the work. So right now, how does it work differently? It's a free text field, you said. It's not based on...
Yeah, so that specific question where we ask you, like, who do you follow on YouTube, for example, that you just type in freeform, like, names. The downside is then you might forgot someone, right? So you might follow Theo and you and Jack Harrington, but maybe you forget to type in Jack because you're not thinking about that. Whereas if you were prompted with all those names, then you would remember. So that's why freeform questions are a bit worse in terms of the data you get from them. But, if you start pre-filling the answers, if you offer predefined options, that's when you run into the issue that we had with all those male names. Yeah,
it's a rock and a hard place, man. And that's another reason to really at least like respect the work that you're doing and the way you're trying to do it right. I think that's so commendable that, hey, again, I mentioned earlier this like responsibility. I think it's no secret that now, especially that the surveys have taken off, there's a sense of responsibility that it's nice to see you like executing on. I'd love to switch gears a little bit and talk about post-survey. So we talked so far about what it takes to make a great survey. Let's talk about what it takes to make great survey results. Once you close the survey, I assume there's a lot of analysis and validation that you need to do. You mentioned you have a design background, not a data science background. So I'm curious, did you get this right the first time? If not, what's the process for analyzing and then validating all this data?
Yeah, so one thing that confuses me with data science is I feel, okay, if you are a really good data scientist, you know all the formulas, you can really extract things from, find the negative wisdom in the data. Like, how do you explain it to people? Because they're not data scientists. So how do you then make them understand how you came to that conclusion, right? And I'm not a data scientist, so my philosophy is actually to keep things super simple. So there's no like any kind of fancy analysis. It's just showing you percentages. The most complicated we get is like medians and percentiles. That's literally the only calculation I make. Because I feel anything more complex than that, you're not going to be able to explain that to somebody who doesn't also have a data science background. And so, the data processing part is fairly simple. Now, what's more complex is, okay, how do you visualize that? And because there's actually many ways to visualize the same data, right? You can visualize it over time as trends. You can just give people the view for a single year. You can cross-reference two different factors, to different questions. So I would say my focus is more on that.
Yeah, okay, so you mentioned your focus is the visualization of the data. Again, you have a design background. You have specifically, I think in the state of JS and CSS surveys, quadrant charts have been really popular. People have loved these. And the quadrants are adopt, assess, avoid, analyze. So if you take something like React, should you adopt it? Should you assess it? Meaning decide, should you avoid it because it's dying, or should you analyze it a bit more? People seem to love these. I think this is super awesome because they're like action oriented. How do you decide which visualization method best fits which data set?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I think the way it kind of evolves organically is that you find new ways of looking at the same data. So, for example, we have this quadrant chart where on the y-axis, vertical axis, it's usage, and or is it popularity? Popularity or satisfaction is a better way to phrase it. And then on the x-axis, it's usage. So it tells you if there's things that are very niche but very popular, which would be maybe like a solid, if we're talking about JS frameworks, or very popular and also used a lot. So React has a pretty high degree of satisfaction, high usage. But another way that we visualize very similar data is with a tier list. So the tier list is also based on satisfaction, and but not usage this time. And so the idea is you can give people different ways to look at the same data set, and by combining those, they can kind of form an opinion, in aggregate, I guess, rather than just taking a single chart or a single way of looking at things, which might, have its own bias or maybe be misleading in some ways. So that's why we also have just the raw data. So we show you for React, okay, we showed you React on that chart with the X and Y axis corresponding to this and that metric. But here are all the raw metrics that we collected. So actually how many people say they use it, how many people said they are interested in learning it, and so on. So it might, I guess the downside is it might be a bit repetitive because you are seeing the same basic underlying data multiple times. But I do think it lets people, first of all, get a better picture of the data, and also some people might gravitate naturally towards some charts or other. And that's the advantage of having like a web app, a website, right? It's not like a physical report which would end up being like 200 pages and then people have to sift through the whole thing. Here, they can just jump through the report and go to the part they're interested in, maybe skip things that they don't care as much about. So that's really my approach, I would say.
Fantastic. Have you noticed, has anyone come up to you and mentioned this to you? Meaning, do you have any idea of ways the different visualizations have influenced how developers receive the information?
Well, I think I mainly see it on X or Blue Sky when people share the charts. Like, it's interesting to see like how different people will just share different charts and have a different takeaway corresponding to the chart. And like the tier list is a cool example because some people are like, oh, that's really cool. The people who are into YouTube, they're familiar with the tier list format, so they really think it's cool. And then people who don't know it, maybe they're not as online, they're like, well, what do the letter means? Like, what's rank S? Like, and it's a bit confusing for them. But I think that's kind of cool. That's okay. You can have different things for different people.
What's the most S tier thing to you right now?
I think Vite is probably the most established S tier project. Vite and Vitest always have super high satisfaction scores, which is pretty impressive, to be honest.
Yeah, Evan Yu, what a guy. The episode just before this one was with Alexander Lichter, the developer advocate at Void Zero, which is the company now behind Vite and Vitest and all these things. And so I'm interested to see where that goes because they're talking about Vite Plus
Yes.
because it's a company now. Have you heard anything about this?
Yes, I was at a conference where Evan talked about that, actually, yeah.
They were super secretive when I asked them about it. Is it some type of Premium Vite?
I don't want to. No, I don't think it's really that. It's more like a more integrated approach to Vite, like just trying to maybe do a bit more and kind of package more things with Vite, but bringing the same like high quality and developer experience that Vite already has. But yeah, I'm really not an expert on that.
What does your data processing pipeline look like? Because you mentioned this whole thing is a custom app, which so the UI is probably like a React form or some type of form.
Yes.
And then this form gets submitted. I'm assuming you probably submit data on every step as opposed to like once at the
Yes.
end of the form. But this data has to be processed somehow and then needs to be stored somehow. And so while the web app is open source, I don't know that the infrastructure and all the stuff behind the scenes is open source, but I'm curious, like people who listen to this podcast tend to appreciate like how things work under the hood and deep
Sure.
dives like that. Would you be willing to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, yeah, and I've written publicly about it, and all the code is public anyway. So
Even for the
we,
infra?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Whoa, cool.
yeah. I mean, that's I'm used to just publishing all my code because I didn't want to pay for a GitHub premium plan. So,
Yeah. Nice.
but yeah, we store all our data in a MongoDB database, which is actually like a legacy choice because I was very much into the Meteor ecosystem back in the days, and they picked Mongo. So, path dependency, I just stayed on that track for the next 10 years. So I don't know if it's the best for what we're doing, but it works well enough. And then we do use Mongo's aggregation pipelines to process the data a bit. But then there's also like a layer that's written in JavaScript in Node, I guess, which, is probably not as great as a dedicated data processing language. But the advantage is even if we move away from Mongo, that part of the code doesn't have to change as long as as long as we get, Postgres or whatever to return the same data shape as Mongo, then the Node.js code can take over and do the same thing.
Nice.
So that's our Node backend, and that backend actually generates a GraphQL API, which is how we actually access the data. And the reason for that is I really enjoy GraphQL's discoverability, especially I don't know if people know that, but there's a plugin called the GraphQL Explorer, which shows you the tree of your API, and you can
Wow.
drill down and actually build your query. It's like a query builder for GraphQL, basically. And this is really cool because we have a pretty complex API, and you can actually select the question you want, with the filters you want, and it's like an IDE for our data, basically.
That's amazing.
And yeah, it's really handy internally when we are, building the queries, but also we expose it publicly as well. So if you're a data scientist or just you want some access to the data to build your own data viz, you can use that to get some raw JSON, or, you can also query the API directly using any GraphQL client or even just a fetch request, which is what we do from the Gatsby app, basically a React static site generator, which fetches the data through the API and then presents it into charts. So it's a fairly complex pipeline, but it works well enough.
Amazing. Where's this all hosted?
Most of it on render.com, which I really like. And then some of it on Vercel just for the scaling aspect, like the app you use to take the survey. We never want to have to worry about that crashing under load if 10,000 people decide to take the survey all at once. So that's on Vercel for now. But eventually I do like Render because it lets you also host your static sites on the same platform. And I really enjoy having everything under one roof. You can share environment variables, that kind of thing. So
nice.
I'm
What's been the biggest? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. You're always trying to keep everything sort of in the same place.
Simplify everything. Like over time, I've learned that a lot of developers will make things more complex given a chance to do so. In the name of efficiency, performance, whatever. And I'm like, okay, it's almost never worth it for me. I'd rather take something that works 80% as well, but is like half as simple rather than try to optimize and get into the weeds too much, because that's really come back to bite me many times in the past.
That's yeah, I agree. I also make things needlessly complex just because I want to play and get my hands dirty and have some fun. But I always like, if it's something that's going to go out to the real world and real users, I will always try to be like, wait. This is not about me. This is about them. So let's simplify. What's the biggest traffic spike you've ever experienced with this?
I would say like the big one is always when we announce the survey to our mailing list, because we have about 90,000 developers on there. So, of course, people don't really usually all take the survey at once. And it's not like we have 100% like conversion rate anyway. But that's always a big spike. And otherwise, what's really impressive is seeing what kind of traffic YouTubers like Theo or Kevin Powell or Primagen, they can really generate traffic on a scale that's like unmatched by anything else on the internet, I would say. Like it's kind of crazy to see that one guy on YouTube will have the same impact as an entire site or an entire social network sometimes even.
Yeah, that is crazy. I wish that translates to these people as as a sense of responsibility, like you can't say things when you have that level of influence anymore, because you probably do more harm than good, like if, for example, if nobody's listening to me, in fact, I'll say when nobody's listening to me, I say a lot of messed up stuff. Between me and my brother-in-law Philip, like, nobody listens to these conversations, but it's just really, really bad stuff. And that's because nobody's like, the impact radius of my words is like one person. But of course, like on this podcast, on social media, I'm not going to say the same things because there's a broader impact rate. Like, and I never know who's going to catch strays, to speak slang. By catch strays, I mean, get caught in the crossfire.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I bet with a survey like yours, which is intended to reach a huge amount of people, you've got to be extra sensitive to that, kind of as we talked about earlier. Which is I wanted to dive in, given that the audience is quite large. Some statistics in your survey are open to misinterpretation, obviously, because people interpret things differently. And then it's your responsibility to communicate context. Hey, no, the context, just so because context usually will avoid misinterpretation. Yeah. How do you do that?
Yeah, I think, I really try to provide a ton of context, maybe even too much, because, there's kind of two approaches to a survey like the one I do. Like, you can go more towards the data or more towards the narrative or the report. So you'll really see that if you look at other surveys. Like, a lot of them, it's almost more like, you just scroll through and they show you figures like, this many developers use that, and it's not very structured, and it's more like about going through the thing and being a bit passive. And I think that's great because it's easier to digest, basically. That's how you get people to actually go through the whole thing. For better or for worse, what I do is more give you the data with less editorializing, I think. And the downside is it requires a bigger effort on people's part, and it's a bit more dry. But there's also less risk of, saying something that might not be correct or pointing out a correlation that's not verified. So it's always a hard balance to strike between those two end of the spectrum, I think.
Yeah, it's always the trade-offs. All right, I want to shift gears a little bit and dive into something that I consider to be one of the most interesting parts of this discussion, which is findings from the survey. So we talked about how to construct a survey. We talked about post-survey data collection, the backend, the deployment, and the visualization. Let's talk now about the actual results.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about the results of the latest survey. People can just go discover that for themselves. We don't need to sit here and outline them. But I do want to highlight some portions of trends over the years. And I'll start with this. Over the past, you've been running the survey now 7 years. Over the past 7 years, what have been some of the most surprising trends regarding maybe, let's say, JavaScript frameworks over the last few years?
So, yeah, there's a couple trends that are surprising. One, I would say, is how little things are changing in a way. So, because that's the image we have, right? Like we mentioned it before, there's a new JavaScript framework every day. But then you look at the data, and then React and Vue are doing great. They're like more popular than ever. People still love them. Angular is even, catching up a little bit. They're kind of having a comeback. And you have new projects like Svelte, but Svelte has been around for, what's it, like 5 years, 6 years maybe?
Yeah.
It's been around for a while. It's not really new. So even the new kid on the block is actually, not that new. And I think that surprised me, because I did expect that every year the rankings would shift, and you would have this new crazy hot thing that's coming in and disrupting everything. And that was part of the fun of the concept for the original state of JS, right? Like, oh, let's see what crazy thing is going on in the JS ecosystem. But it's not that wild, actually. So that was a bit surprising, and I think it's good. It's good for developers, because it means you can take a break for like 3 years, come back, and you'll be fine. Like, you'll spend an afternoon like catching up on the latest React or Vue or whatever version, but your code will still work. All those teams are doing an amazing job with backwards compatibility. There are very few breaking changes. They really usually listen to community feedback. They even backtrack on some stuff. And they've been doing that for like a decade or more. So my hat's off to them, like all those teams. They do a really great job, I think.
This is so interesting, because you set out to start the survey to prove that JavaScript is chaotic AF.
Yeah.
Turns out it's not.
Yeah.
But this disconnect is very interesting. I want to double click on this disconnect a little bit, because there's still this perception. Literally, someone said to me within the last 4 weeks, "Oh, but there's a new JavaScript framework every week." Some people keep saying this, but you've proven it's just not true. So then I guess this begs the question: why do we feel like this? And I don't expect you to have the answer, but I think it is definitely worth exploring. Right? Could it be that we just see so much novelty? We see so much new stuff on social media. We see so many hype thread boys saying you're going to miss out. We see people with screaming face thumbnails on YouTube. Do you think it's just like the subliminal, subconscious effects of an attention economy targeted creator marketing scheme? Or like, I'm curious, like, why do you think people feel this way?
Yeah, I mean, we've had so many clear, glaring examples of this just in the past few years, like NFTs. All of a sudden, everybody was hyping NFTs, and thankfully, JavaScript frameworks are like, way more useful than NFTs. But it's the same thing. Like, if you come up with a new JavaScript framework, you're going to be very invested in hyping it. You're gonna, amass a small community around it and hype that community. I was part of that for Meteor.js, which was a really cool framework, but it didn't take over the world like we think it did. Like, I was telling people, oh, it's going to take over the world. I wrote a book about it. I invested 100% of my career and life into that framework. And
Wow.
today it's kind of nowhere. It still exists, but it's, I would bet most people listening to this haven't even heard of Meteor.js. So I was right in the middle of that phenomenon, of that hype cycle thing. And so it totally makes sense to me that people would also get caught up. And I don't even think there's any like ill intent, unlike maybe things like NFTs or crypto, where there's a lot of scammers. For open source, it's just, how it is. Like, if you don't play that game, it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy where people are not even going to discover your thing, and it's not going to take off at all. So if you want to have a chance to become the next React, you're going to have to pretend that you're going to become the next React. And so that the consequence of that is that people get this impression that there's a 1,000 new React coming out every year, when it's just not the case.
That's so interesting. Ultimately, it sounds like there's a great book by Viktor Frankl, who's a survivor of the Auschwitz concentration camp. And his book is titled Man's Search for Meaning. That's really exactly what this sounds like. Is like you build a cool project, and you just want meaning, right? You just want people to use your thing because you think it's cool, and so you're going to go on YouTube and make all the thumbnails and make noise about it. because you want people to use your thing, and rightfully so. You think it's awesome. I do this sometimes. Like I ship some podcast episodes, even this one, where I'm like, I want people to listen to it because it is valuable. Like the things you're saying, you're teaching us how to design a great survey, how to process the data. You're informing us on today, like the state of frameworks and so on. There's value here, and so of course I'm going to go like tell everyone like, hey, listen to this episode with Sacha. But I guess a lot of us don't realize that we are parts of a system, and we feed this collective sense of, oh my gosh, there's so much new stuff, which at least for me on a personal level is quite eye-opening. After this discussion, I feel like more sensitive to the noise I'm making, because I definitely don't want to contribute to people's sense of FOMO.
Yeah, I think right now it's vibe coding. That's the big thing where everybody is trying to be like, hey, if you don't do that, you're missing out. Yeah, FOMO.
Yeah.
And again, like this recent state of WebDev AI survey showed that, it might be a thing, but the majority of developers are people like me who use, AI code generation on specific things, but they're still typing the majority of their code themselves. So that's what the data shows. And it doesn't mean, it's like, you have to remember that the majority of people are always going to be behind the early adopters. So you are allowed to, not feel bad, just go on your daily life and add those things and learn those things, and as you go, when you're able to. But definitely don't buy too much into the hype that everybody now is vibe coding and generating. Like I always like to say, it's like people are writing a whole app before breakfast, while the rest of us are just like doing a npm install, still waiting for the thing to finish.
Yeah, I hate vibe coding. I hate it so much. It's interesting, I've experienced this midwit meme, the meme that's like a bell curve, and on the one hand you have a beginner, and on the middle you have like the Jedi, and at the end, this meme probably. And I got into it. I thought it was great, and now I hate it. And I hate it because I started doing less and less coding. I started doing more and more let the machine do it, to the point where the machine just makes a bunch of nonsense, Sacha. It just makes like so much nonsense. And then what's my job? I'm like a human toilet cleaner. I have to like clean the nonsense that it created. And I hate this so much. And this happened to me. So I had a pair vibe coding session with my friend Daniel last week on Thursday, and on Tuesday. And I said, let's vibe code something together. And we spent like an hour, 45 minutes vibe coding. It produced nonsense. And at the end of it, I deleted everything. And I said, you know what? It's just easier if I do this myself. And I started from scratch. Within 45 minutes, I had a perfect working app, favicon, OG image, ready to go, production ready. And yeah, I think vibe coding, just a voice against all the hype. It's a bunch of nonsense. Now, I will say this, AI assisted coding, kind of like you just said, Sacha, that can work. So in Cursor, I'm assuming many of us use Cursor, there's Command I to bring up the agent, which is what a lot of people use for vibe coding. And there's Command K to bring up like inline, like an inline assistant. That inline assistant is so much more valuable, personally, to me, where you just like say, hey, make this algorithm faster, and you've selected the text. I'm curious, have you used Cursor to this capacity? Like, have you experimented with the various modes, or what's your take on that?
No, so what I do is I'll ask ChatGPT, hey, how do I make a function that does XYZ? And I copy paste in VS Code. I don't use anything else. I'm okay being a couple years late, I'll just let other people figure out all the hard parts and join when it's ready to go.
That's awesome. That's I mean, you probably learned this from your survey, it sounds like. It sounds like, according to your survey, most of the world doesn't need or follow the latest hype cycle. They just like do their own thing until they catch up. Awesome. You mentioned State of WebDev AI survey. Is that a new survey you're running?
Yeah, so that's a survey we just released. I published the results last month, and the data was collected in earlier this year. So,
whoa,
I wanted to have a State of AI survey, but there's like literally six or seven other State of AI surveys. So, just to differentiate it, I called it State of WebDev AI survey, because it's about specifically how web developers are using AI tools to code web apps. Because a lot of the other surveys are actually focused on AI developers. so AI engineers, which is a very different thing. Like, we're not interested in how to develop AI tools. We're interested in how to leverage those tools to actually do our job, making web apps. So that's really what
Well
the survey
said.
focuses on. And I would say the other specificity is I really tried to get people who don't use AI or don't like AI to also take the survey, right? So in the messaging, I was like, hey, even if you don't care about AI, please take the survey so we know that X many people actually don't use Cursor or don't use any, coding assistance. And in fact, you have a chart that shows you per section how many tools people use. So so models, ChatGPT, Claude, this and that. On average, I think the average developers has tried 4 of them. But for coding assistants, the majority have tried like 0 of them, stuff like that. So that's interesting to see because it does give you perspective that, hey, of course, the hype cycle on X, especially on X, is gonna make you think that AI is just everywhere. But the reality is that, yeah, it's not here yet. It's still, the future is not evenly distributed or whatever the quote is.
Yeah. Yeah, I had no idea this survey was a thing. I'm so interested. So what are the insights? I mean you just mentioned the main insight is that Twitter's a lie, or X is it's false urgency, so to speak. But you mentioned, for example, in the case of UI frameworks, your biggest surprise or observation was things just don't move as fast as they seem, and Angular is kind of having a comeback. With the WebDev AI one, anything like stand out in a profound way?
Yeah, so one thing I was really interested in finding out was how much of people's code is AI generated, and it's not that much. So I would have to double check, but I think it was, first of all, very few people generate like 100% or even like 80% of the code. The majority was around like maybe the 20-30% range. And then I also asked how much of that code you have to refactor. And again, the majority of people did refactor the code. So even though AI is helping out, very little of the end result code was written directly by the AI. It's either written by the developer or written by the AI, but then refactored to change variable names, fix, repeating statements, any any number of reasons, formatting, styling, stuff like that. So I think it's interesting because, like you said with your own example, that the promise is kind of, hey, the AI is going to code for you, but if you have to come back behind the AI and kind of fix everything, the productivity gain is not that big, at least right now. And I think that kind of goes against the narrative that developers are going to go away, that our job is going to be done by AI. At least currently in 2025, that's definitely not the case, because even the developers that are leveraging AI still need to, babysit the AI, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting because I would love to see this experiment. I would even fund it. Since we're talking about surveys and scientific style experiments, I would be very interested in an experiment where 2 cohorts, so let's say Group A and Group B, are given an application to build, but Group A engineers the application. They write the code themselves. Group B vibe codes and babysits AI. And it can be a trivial application, but I would be very interested in the time taken to complete the application, because if the outcomes are so interesting, yeah, if the time taken across Group A and B is equal, that means you just get to choose what gives you the most joy. Is it actually writing code yourself, or is it playing project manager and talking to some AI and babysitting it? If the time taken to vibe code is longer, well, that definitively proves that we're not there yet. Or if it's shorter, then we can maybe explore or answer the question with a bit more confidence about where jobs are going.
Well, you also need Group C and Group D to come back 6 months later and maintain the apps. I think that's going to be the real test.
Yeah, that's so true. What I've noticed with vibe coding is also the AI agents love putting everything in one file. So I've got some vibe coded files that are 2,000 lines long, which for me, if you've been on a team with me, I typically have lint rules that will restrict files to 100 lines and then warn if a file is between 100 and 200 lines. But if a file is more than 200 lines long, I just reject it completely. I was like, no, this needs to be separate modules for sure.
I mean, not even talking about AI, if you have to understand code but written by somebody else, by another developer, that's already hard, right? Like
Yeah.
I've had the problem with open source, especially like somebody will contribute something, and then I realize, okay, I didn't have to write it, but I have to understand it to be able to maintain it. And because I didn't write it, that's maybe they're using patterns that I don't know or I don't understand. And it's often even more work to understand somebody else's code because, the reason why you understand your own code is you had to go through the mental steps necessary to produce that code as an outcome. So you're teaching yourself what the code does as you're writing it. If the AI writes your code, then how do you, achieve that mental model of what the code is doing?
That is such a good insight. Wow. Just in case anyone missed the crazy wisdom that Sacha just dropped, I'll repeat this. You're teaching yourself how the code is supposed to work while you're writing it. That's amazing. And if an AI writes it, you miss out on all of that experience, and you just assume, okay, well, this code is just supposed to work somehow. Like you miss the entire mechanism, and it becomes a black box, which is going to make it harder for you to maintain, but even more hard for someone else to maintain because you can't even explain it to them. Man, that's incredible. You mentioned there's a just switching from the AI topic to just broader code, there's a lot of work being done. So the previous episode with Alex Lichter from Void Zero, he's talking about tools like roll down, which is like roll up but Rust. And he's talking about, Void Zero is doing a lot of work to write modern JavaScript tooling in Rust because it's faster. We see Microsoft rewriting TypeScript's compiler in Go, again, in pursuit of speed. There's an excellent article on web.dev titled Milliseconds Make Millions, arguing that speed is important. I'm curious, in your surveys, do you have any findings that suggest that that's very, very true? Meaning developers really prefer tooling that is way faster, even if not feature complete with slower tools.
I don't have any specific data on that, but my intuition would be that that's probably not true. Like, I think what makes a tool appealing, of course, speed is great, but okay, so this is a good jumping off point to another trend that's kind of the I would say the key finding of the whole surveys. Like, if I had to sum everything up in one thing, it would be that, which is like the boomerang effect. So we have one chart which plots, what is it, like similar to the quadrant chart, but a bit different. But on the x-axis, it's like positivity, negativity, positivity. And then the y-axis, it's usage. And what we see is as a framework, so, and also, okay, the difference is plotted over time. So imagine these trajectories over time that go through the XY chart. And at the beginning, when a framework is gaining users, gaining popularity, over time, it also gains positive opinion.
Yeah.
And then there's comes an inflection point where it starts losing positive opinion and going more towards the negative side as it keeps on gaining users. So what's going on a lot is that when a tool is first introduced, there is the hype that we talked about. Also, its feature set is pretty small, and typically it will do a couple things very well. Also, it's building on the shoulders of giants that came before. So Vite is building on top of Webpacks, like learning the lessons of Webpack. Not literally, of course, but just in terms of, avoiding the same mistakes. And so there's a huge influx of positivity. People are really enthusiastic about that new framework, library, bundler, whatever it is. But then when that bundler is confronted to the real world and real use cases, sometimes edge cases, people start to realize, oh, actually, there's still gaps in what it does. Also, it gets more popular, so more people use it. That means you're not just talking about like the hardcore community of early adopters that are really invested, maybe have even invested their identity into that community, right? You have just more random people who might not know who whatever Evan Yo is or who, Dan Abramov is. They're just using the tool, and if there's any problem, they won't be shy about sharing that. And there comes a point where, yeah, people are like, well, Vite, maybe not, but, or Webpack is a good example. Webpack, yeah, it used to be great, but now the config is too hard. And then Vite is coming along, making Webpack seem worse in comparison. I know people are jumping off onto the Vite bandwagon, but they still have to use Webpack for their work. And they're like, that's when you really start to hate Webpack, because you have to use it, but there's something easier out there, and you resent it even more. And so there's always this cycle that very few projects avoid. Vue might be one that's doing a pretty good job. Vue, React are kind of avoiding it a bit, but I think it's just a natural evolution. And so to come back to your question about these new projects that have a lot of speed, but maybe fewer features, they're in that early phase where people are going to be wowed by the speed and try them on maybe smaller scale projects where their limitations are not as apparent. But these projects will have they will have to grow and add on these missing features, which will make them slower, one might assume, or maybe more bloated or harder to grasp when you're first using them. And eventually they will be replaced by something else that comes along, is even faster, has learned the lessons, and maybe has a prepackaged config that kind of does things for you. And that's just how it's going to be until the end of time, I think.
That's amazing. Wow, that's like the journey of successful products. We had an episode with Brandon Bayer, the founder of Flight Control, and he talked similarly about, he called it the hype meter, but for products. And let's consider for a second Webpack and Vite. I think these are great examples as products. And so you said Webpack was out, but it's been out long enough to the point where it's well established, it's adopted. But there are things, it's so mature that there are things that people hate about it. And so along comes this new thing, Vite, that's winning because it's got some early promise of speed. And so people are already feeling the FOMO. It's like, oh, there's this new thing. Oh, maybe, and maybe it's better than Webpack. And so they learn from Webpack's mistakes, and more and more jump on the bandwagon to the point where they supersede Webpack. At least for new projects, I'm sure there's Webpack. Like, it's the WordPress thing. Yeah, WordPress still runs most of the internet, but not new stuff, probably. And this is how projects grow until something comes to replace even Vite. Okay, that's so interesting. And this is how they grow. So over time, the newer, faster thing shows initial promise, but then they start listening to their users as well and adding things that the users want to make it even more annoying to be on the other thing, Webpack, and make them want to switch. I think we've seen this over and over again. I love this example because I think of like Jest and Vitest, right? It's the same thing. What about Puppeteer and Playwright? Same thing. Wow, I wonder what's next. I'm curious, this hasn't happened yet with Node.js and Bun, at least not to my knowledge. Do we know why?
I would assume that Node.js just has a huge incumbent advantage. It's been around for so much longer than Bun. But other than that, yeah, it really fits the pattern. Like, Bun comes in with so many things pre-configured for you. It's a lot faster to set up, like TypeScript just works. It does more. It's faster. I think that's a great example. I wouldn't be surprised if those two follow the same trajectory. Then again, Node.js, a bit like Webpack. Like, Webpack also has a huge head start. I think actually Vite, I don't want to over-index too much on Vite because I think Vite is kind of a special project. Like, I don't want to make it seem like Vite is all hype or whatever and it's going to deflate. I think Vite is truly like one of those once in a blue moon projects where all the stars align and the team is great, the community is great, they built on the success of Vue. It's been adopted even outside the Vue ecosystem. There's Vitesse, there's Void Zero. So yeah, Vite might be the one that, escapes its fate of coming back down. But yeah, Node and Bun, that's very interesting, and I definitely want to see how that evolves.
Yeah, I bet if I'm the Bun team, I would be so perplexed. I would be scratching my head every day. I'm like, oh, why? What are we missing? And so if I reflect on my own developer journey, I've used Bun maybe once, but Node.js isn't painful enough. I think this is maybe the trigger, yeah? Because like if we consider
Yeah.
Webpack to Vite, Webpack just became so painful, man. There was loaders,
Oh,
there was plugins, there was so much in the config, and Vite is like, no, 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 we can do all this without any problem. But
I
then,
know the answer, actually.
oh, let's go. What is it?
Is the client, right? As soon as you involve server client, server browser, that's what makes our entire field is so complex because of that. Node is only on the server. It's like Express. You can still use Express however many years later, even though there's much better
Yeah.
alternatives because it's a server thing and there's a ceiling to how complex it's gonna get. As
Hmm.
soon as you bundle things, send them to the client, APIs, whatever, talking back and forth, that's where the complexity explodes. And it's funny that, we have been trying to solve the same problems for like 10, 15 years back to Ajax. And
Yeah.
sometimes it seems we're not making that much progress, I think.
Yeah.
And for me, that's the other thing I see over and again. As soon as you involve any data exchange, anything that involves client server, all bets are off. And I think
Yeah.
that's why there's not, even though things don't change as fast as people think they do, at the same time, the ecosystem is not quite stable. It's not stagnating like maybe the server might get away with Node, Express, and so on, because we still try to fix those problems. I don't know if you agree or not with
Yeah.
my
Well,
analysis.
I definitely kind of agree. But also, like, I think of Node.js not just as a server, but as a runtime, like the browser. Like it runs JavaScript and gives context to it. And if we consider runtime to runtime comparison, Node.js and Bun, I still wonder, like, why? What is it? And for me, it's just that Node.js is not painful enough for me to consider switching. Whereas I was saying earlier with Webpack, it became very painful. There was the config, there was the plugins, there was the loaders. It was very painful. And then Vite shows up and is like, no, no, we're fine. Just Vite. The cool thing about Vite, this has become like a Vite party, I guess. But I think one of the things I love the most about Vite is it disappears. You just run Vite and it's like, cool, here's your thing, port 5173, goodbye. Vite doesn't, like Steve Jobs often said, the best products are the ones that are invisible. They disappear. You don't notice them. And Vite is like that. I don't have to spend a lot of time. If I want to extend it with some custom config, I can, but it most of the time just works. Whereas Webpack was not that. Webpack didn't disappear as much as Vite. And if I think about Node.js and Bun, I don't have to do anything with Node. I just like
Yeah.
install Node and it's just there. It's just a run. And I think this is probably why Bun is having a hard time because like what are you going to do? How are you going to disappear more than Node? I can't remember the last time I touched Node. And I think that's really the problem. Because also, if you look at Jest and Vitest, it's the same thing. With Jest, the mocking story and the spy story was a lot more complex than with Vitest, including TypeScript support. My goodness, if you wanted to add TypeScript support to Jest, forget it. Whereas Vitest is just TypeScript out of the box. Now, some would say, okay, but with Bun, it's TypeScript out of the box. Guess what? Node.js also now, So I think this is the game they're playing. I love this analogy you've given us because I can so clearly see Node.js catching up to Bun by saying, hey, no, we also support TypeScript now. Don't switch. Yeah. And they also
Yeah.
added the test runner to Node.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so cool. Wow, this is how you compete, man.
Well, yeah, that's the other thing that we're seeing, and I think it's maybe recent, or in the last 5 years, let's say that older frameworks are like adopting, whatever the Microsoft strategy, like extend. I don't know what it was, but there was this concept that you adopt what your competitors are doing and do it better than them, and kind of use your your existing advantage to extinguish them. And I think Node is doing that. React, they're also changing. They're like now projects are not shy about changing the way they work by
Yeah,
importing concepts from the outside. Like even Svelte kind of changed the way they do things. And I think that's interesting because if you go back one generation before, like things like Backbone, jQuery, it doesn't seem to me like they ever changed their fundamental principle. Like jQuery, you chain things and you modify the DOM, and it's always been that. It didn't do like, oh, actually, we need to be more declarative or be more
yeah.
reactive or do this or that. And so, yeah, that's a good point that you're bringing up. Like Node might very well just cannibalize by just adopting the same feature set and then leveraging their existing market share.
Yeah. Yeah. Are you you have a lot of experience. You've been running these surveys for 7 years now and counting. Do you plan to like write a book or something? I think that that would be I would buy that for sure.
I hadn't thought about it. Well, I think the answer is no because I mean, I would hope that I would write a book about something less boring than just JavaScript.
Yeah.
I did write a book about Meteor, but it was like a tutorial book, which I actually enjoyed a lot. But in terms of just writing a book about trends or whatever, I think, yeah, I don't find it that interesting. even
Fair
though
enough.
even though that's what I do.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
my day job.
I have two more questions for you. Sort of zooming out and giving us like a broader perspective. You've ran again the survey for a very long time, and we've talked about a lot of lessons you've learned along the way. Lessons around representation, lessons around the state of women in the industry and minorities, lessons around the fact that things don't move as fast as they seem. And these are all valuable lessons, no doubt. If we could condense them all into the most important lesson you've learned from running these surveys over the last 7 years, what would it be?
Oh, you're really putting me on the spot.
You could just pick one from the ones I listed, or synthesize a new one. Up to you.
Yeah, give me a second to think. I think
The
so like I said, the that boomerang trend, that hype cycle, whatever you want to call it, that's definitely something that explains a lot of the JavaScript ecosystem specifically. I'm going to give you a couple things because I don't think I can have a single takeaway. So I'm
Perfect.
going to give you three or four. Sorry. So that's the one that we already talked about. I think that's important because it lets you get a bit of perspective, right? You're like, okay, actually, it doesn't really matter if I take a break, like I said, for 3, 4 years, because one, things don't move as fast as they do. Two, things follow a fairly predictable cycle, so you can kind of judge what part of the cycle you're on. You can see that the tool is gonna stick around for a couple more years, and you have some time to, you're not gonna be out of a job if you just stick with React and don't learn Svelte or Solid or whatever. So that's one that's really brought me peace of mind. Another thing, on a more personal level, I've learned a lot about how the web works behind the scenes. So the people who write the CSS specifications, the new HTML, JavaScript features, I didn't have that much clarity into that before, and I still only know a little bit of that, but what I've been amazed is how open the process is. Because when you think about it, like the people, first of all, it's not that many people, right? You might think, okay, Google has however many hundreds of thousands of employees, Apple, same. So you might imagine that there's, buildings full of thousands of engineers working on new browser features, new CSS features, and so on. Actually, a ton of the work is done by literally less than 50 people worldwide. It's the same names over and over again. If you just look at the spec authors, it's pretty amazing. And then those people are very easy to access. You have public working groups, public chat rooms. They hold Zooms, Google Meet meetings that are open that you can join. I've joined them. And that's how the web is made. And it's pretty amazing. The other thing, those people, they work at Google, Apple, and so on, but they do not care about the companies. They care about the web. And I was so impressed because so Google, full disclosure, they finance my work, but at no point did they ever make any insinuation that, oh, you should do this because it would be good for Chrome, or they like, oh, can we help you get in touch with the people at Apple, or oh, you should really talk to Microsoft because the Edge team is doing this and that. And the same people will also, go from working for Google one year to Apple the next. There's a lot of, communication between them. And I was really pleasantly surprised at how it's basically like open source, it's not gated at all, or as far as I can tell. I don't actually work for those companies, so maybe I'm a bit naive, but that was a very interesting thing I learned. I don't know if that matches with your experience from meeting those people.
Totally. I mean, Una Kravitz, she's not a
Yeah,
guest yet, but she's a dear friend of mine and does most of the work. Well, I mean, not most of it, but she does a lot of work on the CSS language specification, as well as Jen Simmons over at Apple. So this is Google,
yeah,
Apple working on CSS. Absolutely. I love how open. The web is built on open standards, and that's why it's so special. It's the most special platform on earth, period. Yeah,
yeah.
like web properties can go back 30 years, even more, and just work. And nothing is as reliable as the web. So I 100% echo what you've said. Always been on the web because it's a great platform made by great people. We actually had the privilege of having Ujwal Sharma, the chairperson of TC39 that
Yeah.
makes JavaScript, on the podcast. And yeah, that episode, we'll put it in the show notes. He's just such a brilliant person. We should maybe have more standards people, I think. But no, I fully agree. Similar experience. Well, that I think those lessons are huge. Really, like, one, I'm not going to miss that bag, or all the influencers are lying to me. It's fine. I can take my time. And two, the web is open and a highly collaborative, open effort, and these people are easy to access. Just go on GitHub and open an issue. Even sometimes, super valuable. There's a lot of optimism in your surveys. Usually, so it's weird because people tend to say they talk a lot of nonsense about JavaScript. Oh, it's bad, whatever. But also, there's a lot of optimism, and I'd love to wrap up by asking you an optimistic question, which is what is your biggest hope for the impact of your surveys on the ecosystems they are in, specifically JavaScript, CSS, Web AI, etc.
Yeah, my hope would really be that the surveys are a resource like, maybe kind of use like MDN, one place where people can go to find answers, whether those people are end users or even the maintainers. That's why I collect freeform comments, for example, on libraries, so that if you are the Vite maintainer, or especially smaller libraries, maybe you don't have a big Discord with tons of people giving you feedback, you can go to the survey and see what people there think of your library. So I really want to make it a resource for the community, basically. And if I can achieve that and have it be not just do what I'm already doing, but also be a resource in the sense that it's really collecting a lot of data, enough to be credible. So enough that, there's not just, 10 women that took the survey. I'm exaggerating, but, enough so it's not like, oh, there's only 20 people in China who took the survey. All those little things that we're still struggling with, I feel, keep it from being a 100% reliable resource. But if we could get past that and really have it on a much larger scale, I feel then you could really go and trust what you're looking at, and use it as just one factor. I'm not saying base all your life decisions on the survey, but just use it as one more factor to evaluate your next JavaScript library, which CSS feature you should learn, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's really my goal, I would say.
Awesome. What AI tools you should be using? Yeah. So it becomes this this resource. Like, can I use MDN and others? I so respect that. Listen, Sacha, you've given us so much. I mean, from what it takes to create a great survey, to mitigating risks and balancing bias, to giving users the control, to then telling us even how it's built. It's all open source. It's a MongoDB, the database, the hosting story, the visualization story, and now wrapping it up where we are with hope for the future and the direction and the lessons you've learned. On behalf of myself and all the listeners, I just want to take a moment and just really appreciate your good work, and say thank you for contributing, of course, to the show, but also to the ecosystem. I will say your surveys are that for me. When I consider JavaScript, like, for example, Solid.js, we've had a lot of Solid.js people on the podcast, and the sentiments from the survey influence the discussions we have with the Solid.js people. It's driving real impact. And so, even on a personal note, thank you so much for sharing the time here and the discussion and the ideas here on the podcast as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. I don't know if it's okay for me to plug something
Of
that we haven't
course.
really talked about. So, depending on when people are listening to this, but the State of Devs survey should be ongoing until probably May 15th, around that time. And
They have 1 week from the time it ships.
yeah, basically. But, I'm sure most people listen. They're refreshing their podcast app every hour, waiting for the episode to drop. And yeah, the State of Dev survey is the first survey we're doing that's not about coding at all. So it's about everything else, including your career, your workplace environment. What makes you happy at work, what you don't like. Have even things that are a bit more serious, like have you suffered from discrimination issues at work? Have you, what kind of issues or recourse you've had to deal with those issues? But also more fun things like hobbies, like what do you do for fun? What kind of physical activity do you do? What kind of music do you listen to? Movies, even health. So it's really wide ranging, but only about things that are not code. Because, I realized if I meet another developer at a conference, we might talk about our favorite, JavaScript framework, but more often we find commonalities in everything else. Like if we both do climbing or we both like the same TV show. And I was like, yeah, of course, we're developers. We're not only coders. We're full human beings that are, interested in other things as well. So it made sense to finally do a survey about all that as well. And I would love if people, listeners, viewers, as many people as possible could take the survey, just so we have, again, a very wide range of data.
Definitely. We'll do that. In fact, I'll put it in the show notes and in the intro before this episode as well. I will also take it myself. I would love to see the results finally. I wonder how many developers are on creatine, and how many are...
I don't ask. I'm on creatine, full disclosure, but I don't ask that specific question.
Why? I feel like that's such a common thing. Creatine and Coke Zero. I mean, that's,
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not on Coke. I didn't even consider that. I think there's I stopped.
Look
short
at this,
of
Sacha.
asking
For those on the
people,
video, look. This is this is one day. 2 liters
So
of
do you mix
Coke
the
Zero.
creatine into the Coke Zero?
Sometimes I actually do
That's
it in my
horrible.
morning coffee. Actually,
Oh,
but look,
no.
it's not just Coke Zero. Yeah, it's Coke Zero Zero, because
Okay.
it's zero sugar and zero caffeine. So it's basically just water, but more fun. Anyway, on that note, we'll get people to take the survey. I'll go take it now myself. Thank you again, Sacha.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining my discussion with Sacha Greif. Again, I highly recommend and emphasize, please go take the State of Dev survey. There's a link to that in the show notes. This has the potential to increase the quality of life for developers everywhere by identifying actionable interventions that we can take in reflection of real data. If you have enjoyed this discussion, I highly recommend finding Sacha on social media and joining in his audience, but also subscribing to the waitlist of his surveys so that you can take them when they come out. Again, all those links are in the show notes. Please find them. If you're learning from and or enjoying this content, then a great way to support it with no cost to you is to share it on social media and with your friends. If you're watching on YouTube, then a great way to support it, again, without any cost, is to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And of course, leave a comment with any suggestion you have at all, any feedback. I do read them and I carefully consider it. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, then if you leave any review up to 5 stars, that would also help surface this in front of more people. Because ultimately, look, this is for people. This is for the service of people. I don't really gain anything from this. I don't earn an enormous amount of money. Honestly, I don't earn any money. Thank you, code crafters. But this is for you. And so if you find value, then I only ask that you share the value. With that, thank you so much for sticking around. Thank you for being a part of the podcast. And thank you for your interest in engineering.